Good afternoon, everyone. Can we please have our seats quickly because we are already like 7 minutes late and I don't want any of us missing any parts of this insightful second keynote session. Yes.
The session after this is the break, so we're not cutting into anyone's presenting time. But obviously,
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohamed Elsonbaty. I'm sorry I have a kind of cold, but I think it's a very normal thing to happen in Scotland. So, welcome to our second keynote session. I will be with you today as the chair of this session. I am a member of the scientific committee, and also I will be helped with moderator, my friend and colleague here, Alice. And we are going to have a very insightful and interesting keynote session for many reasons. First things first, some house rules. We don't expect to have any fire alarms today, so in case you heard anything, it means it's fire. I don't know why I'm saying this, but during my entire study of science communication in Scotland, for every single lecture, they were telling us that every time. So I think it's kind of Scottish habit, maybe. So just you need to follow the road. The second thing is that for Q&A, all of this will be run virtually. So if you have any questions, simply you need to either scan this QR code or go to the website vvox.app, type this ID number, type your questions. I will receive yours, and I will ask them to our distinguished speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mamoeletsi Mosia, Managing Director of the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement, NRF-SAASTA, with a distinguished career spanning roles from principal scientist at CESOL to senior leadership positions at SCIR. Dr. Mosia brings deep expertise in science communication and leadership, all dedicated to fostering inclusive science communication. Her keynote today, Science Communication and the Gap That We Dare Not to Ignore. This personally has touched me. Being born and raised in Africa, I personally often felt there is a gap between science and society. I could really see this divide, sometimes even physically. A gap that is shaped by a legacy of colonialism, language and cultural diversity, and the coexistence of many forms of knowledge systems, alongside formal scientific institutions. Today, Dr. Mosia will examine the gap between science and society through the lens of national policy frameworks. She argues compellingly for moving from one-way communication to a meaningful dialogue, and how this dialogue, grounded in diverse knowledge and voices, can bridge this divide and make science truly accessible to everyone. So please welcome with me Dr. Mamoeletsi Mosia.
It looks like I have to stand here. No, I'm good. Good afternoon. My name is Mamoeletsi Mosia, and I am the Managing Director of NRF-SAASTA, We are one of the business units within the NRF, which is an organization in South Africa that supports research in its entirety. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I was asked to, I think there's an echo. I don't know if there's an echo, or is it only me who's hearing it? Okay. I was asked to say a little bit about myself, but given the time, may I rather do that at the end, because the 3 next bullets are actually what we are here about, and if time permits, then I'll say a little bit about myself. The title of my talk is Science Communication and the Gap We Dare Not Ignore. That is focused on South Africa. So because of that, I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you a little bit about our country and why it is important for us not to ignore this gap, more so as scientists, more so as science communicators. For those who do not know, which I doubt there is anybody who do not know about our country, those blue, that blue shaded area there, it is our beautiful country at the tip of Africa. We have 9 provinces. As you can see, the dark blue there is it is the smallest province, but it is the most populated. And incidentally, the biggest of our provinces is the least populated. I'm gonna run through these, all of them together. Now this, if you have a photographic memory, make sure that you capture this, because this is the essence of my talk today. The top right is the population of South Africa. 80% of South Africa is made out of Africans. Those are the ones who look like me. And the rest of the 20% is white, coloreds, and Indians. Of the white coloreds, of the coloreds and Indians, some of them would speak English, some of them would, I think the Indians, most of them speak English, but of the coloreds, you find some who speak English and some who speak Afrikaans. And the whites, as well, you find some who speak English and some who speak Afrikaans. Remember that as well. 80% of the population is African. The top left, a graph shows our education level in the country. This is very significant. If you look at the white population, that is less than 10% of the country. 50% of the white population has at least a high school education. And the other 50% has a what is going on? This is sabotaging me. The other 50% has a post-high school education. Now contrast that to the blacks. About 2% of them have no schooling at all. At least just under 20% of them have primary school education. Primary school is up to grade 4. The bulk of the black population, remember they make up 80% of the population in the country, the bulk of them have, as their highest education level, a secondary school education. And then just under 20% have post-secondary education. And that is very similar to the colored population, with the exception that the percentage of individuals with no schooling is negligible. If you look at the far left, my left, that is essentially the picture, the education profile of South Africa right now. We have some people with no schooling. We have some people with primary education. You can imagine their level of understanding then when it comes to science, their interest for that matter. And we have some people with post-secondary school education. We all know women are more than males, so I won't dwell on that one. Now here's another interesting one. As a country, we have 12 official languages, the 12th one being sign language. But our home languages in South Africa, there's 11 of them. 20% of the population speaks isiZulu. The next highest population speaks isiXhosa. Contrast that to English-speaking population, and remember I said coloreds and Indians may also speak English. And then so the whites and the coloreds would speak Afrikaans and English, for instance. So if you look at the population of South Africa, those whose home language is English is less than 10%. What is the significance of this slide? If right now I am communicating to you in English, and basically English is the language of science communication. In a country like South Africa, then how do you balance English being the language of communication when more than 90% of the population does not speak English? How then do you communicate to the population where you have at least 2% of the population with no schooling at all, or 10% of the population whose highest grade in schooling, in terms of school, is grade 4? How then do you, there was a time when we had a challenge with HIV, and now you are a researcher, you've done research work in HIV, and you want to communicate this significant result so that people can change behavior. How do you communicate that if you come and you're speaking in English and I have no clue what you are saying? And yet, from your results, I am expected to change my behavior. This is by far the biggest challenge that we have as a country when it comes to science communication. More about South Africa. We are most industrialized country in Africa. We're still suffering from the legacy of apartheid. And people would say, but it's 31 years later, why are you still speaking about it? That is because there is still some significant inequality in our country. And how do I best describe inequality? So those who've been in Johannesburg, they would know of Sandton. Sandton is known as the richest square mile in Africa. That's because of the industries that are there, the head offices that are there, and the millionaires and billionaires that you would find there. If you go 5 kilometers to my left from Sandton, so if Sandton is this side you would find Alexandra. And Alexandra is one of the poorest square miles in South Africa. Alexandra Township, that's where you find the 80% that I spoke to earlier. That's where you find people who speak isiZulu, who speak Sesotho. And the challenge is that access to science and technology information is based on race. So people in Sandton, it's based on race, your education background, and your geographic location. So the people in Sandton would have access to science and technology information. 5 kilometers on the other side, the people in Alex, based on their education levels, they would not have science and technology information. Yet we want these people to appreciate, to trust science. I've already spoken about our multilingual nature, but we're also very multicultural. So how we do things as Basotho, I am Mosotho, so how we do things is very different to how Zulus do some of the things. And because of that, how do you then bridge that gap? Indigenous knowledge systems. So my mother the other day, she was telling me she used to have toothache and she started chewing some plant. And since she started chewing that plant, her toothache has disappeared. That information comes from her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. And she's supposed to give it to me, and somehow I'm very ignorant of it because I'm a scientist. I am one of those that trust Western science more than our indigenous knowledge systems. But we have a lot of those. And yet, us who are Western scientists, we actually look down on the indigenous knowledge systems. Yet, African people have actually developed over ages with this indigenous knowledge system. The one that I like the most is that we've made significant contributions to science. During COVID, our brilliant researchers, I have to say, they had the ability to isolate the different variants of COVID. And then there was this variant called Omicron, and we isolated it and we named it, and guess what the world did? They closed our borders because they said it originated from us. No, it did not originate from South Africa. It's just that we have very brilliant scientists who were able to isolate and name it. I'm just now telling you that if you want brilliance, come to our country. The last one, this came from the South African Public Relationship with Science Survey. It said South Africans are very curious about science, yet the trust is very low. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to show you how fortunate we are as a country that we have a government that is providing leadership where science is concerned. Very early on in our new democracy, when we had a white paper in science and technology in 1996, and already we identified that science, the public understanding of science is key to national development. And already then, government was supportive of science awareness campaign. In 2019, we had another, just over 20 years later, we had another white paper in science, and now we are saying we need to contribute towards a science literate and science aware society. But how do we get our society to be aware and literate if there is a language barrier already? So now imagine you are a scientist from whatever university in South Africa and you want to communicate. Whenever I talk to young people in particular, I tell them, when you plan your communication, think of the why, what, who, and how. Now, take this picture. This is a graph that came from the South African Public Relationship with Science Survey that we did in 2020 through the HSRC, and you can find the results of the survey there. I've already described the population of South Africa, and this slide already shows us the importance of the differences that I described earlier. Let me see if this works. Yeah. Now, someone who has post-high school education, their interest in science. So the green is the knowledge of science, and the orange is their interest in science. So someone with a degree is very much interested in science, and their knowledge is significantly higher. Contrast that with someone with a primary education. Their knowledge is very low, relatively speaking, and their interest is also very low. Females versus males, and then you see the different races. What is the significance of this? I'm just going to plot a scenario. Imagine you are a scientist, you work at Stellenbosch University. You are doing research in the wine industry. I'm just talking about wine because I understand a lot of people love wine, and therefore they will identify with this analogy. So you are doing research in the wine industry. So in South Africa, farms are often owned by white people. If you saw that picture initially, I had shown that most of the white population has at least a high school qualification. So they own the farm, they have at least a high school qualification. Contrast that to the white farm laborers. A lot of them in the Cape would either be coloreds or African. And you already saw their profile. So chances are, let's assume for the purpose of this conversation, the farm laborers are those with primary school education, which make up just under 20% of the population. Now you have the results that have a bearing on the farm owner and the farm laborer. Now you need to communicate this. Farm owner might speak in English or Afrikaans. The colored community might speak in English or Afrikaans. But then there's the Xhosa community as well. And you are like myself, you are Mosotho, and you are very fluent in English. Now you need to present this information to the community. This slide already helps you to understand the people that you're talking to. It is very important that whenever you go and communicate, you need to know who you are communicating to. You need to know why you are communicating. Is it to increase understanding, to inspire interest, influence decisions? You need to know the type of information. For instance, during COVID, once again, we saw a lot of scientists on television, for instance, and the main purpose of their communication was for public health and safety. But then they were also important in giving government statistics in order for them to make decisions. When they say we're closing the borders, no one can go outside, it was because of the information that they got from the scientists. Therefore, the information that is given to policymakers is different to the information that is given to me as a layperson. The one thing that we have done as a country is we've separated, we've been able to define the different publics. I know I am in an English country, and they would say there is no words as publics. Public is plural enough, but allow us as South Africans to say it is different publics because there is 11 of them here. So it is once again COVID time, and now you have information of health significance. What you say to a learner who needs to go to school is different to what you say to a teacher, is different to what you say to your fellow scientists, is different to what you say to the science interpreters, who are some of us sitting here, or the journalists, for that matter, who are some of us sitting here, and the decision makers. So government need to say, okay, you can go outside for 2 hours now. How you present the information to government is completely different to how you present the information to the general public. And it was very important for us to make this distinction so that when you communicate, you know the level that you need to make your descriptions. And the last one is, so you need to then tailor your message to suit the audience that you are addressing so that you do not lose them. This is very important. I attended a presentation once, and it was 80% of the audience was primary school learners, middle school learners. And this brilliant chemist came, and he was presenting as if he was presenting to Nobel Prize winners. And he lost the audience, and the purpose of his presentation was so that these young people can actually be excited about science, but because he did not read the room, because he did not tailor his message to the right audience, he then lost it. So it is very important as you plan your presentation to be able to tailor it for the right audience. Then you need to know how to present your work. And I've just given you different scenarios there. And when I came in earlier on, they were talking about influencers and how some of them, they actually perpetuate misinformation and disinformation. And it is a challenge that we are faced with as we are sitting here, that South Africans, for instance, based on the South African Public Relationship with Science Survey, we found out that we still trust radio and TV as the source of our science and technology information. What does that mean then when it comes to YouTube, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera? And for us as science communicators, how do we balance between the misinformation and the disinformation for those who want to be popular and talking about things that they are not even able to prove? At the same time, we know that as scientists, we need to ensure that how we communicate and what we communicate can be proven. And then there are on the other side, and what does that do to us in terms of the trust? Because then I'll come and say something that is not true, and then somebody else says no, but then statistics say this, information says this, data says this. And how then do we make sure that society still trusts the information that we are providing? So I just showed the different ways of communicating. That was just a description. Now, the next two slides are just going to, I've just described the challenge in terms of how diverse we are as a country, and I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 examples of the things that collectively as a country we are doing as scientists and science communicators to make sure that we are able to touch and to be able to touch even the one who has not gone to primary school. About 2 years ago, as NRF-SAASTA, we hosted, and the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation, we hosted a dialogue session between traditional healers and scientists or Western medical doctors, for instance. And it was a very interesting conversation. It was a whole day conversation. They all came, and I remember one time this one traditional healer saying, I give my patient a concoction, I tell them drink it every day at 7 a.m. or whatever the case may be. And the medical doctor was asking, how did you prove the efficacy of your concoction? How do you know that it does not damage the kidneys of your patient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And the traditional healer was like, I know, because I've been doing this for the X number of years. And the other one was like, I know, because my grandmother used to do it this way, her mother used to do it this way. I spoke earlier about indigenous knowledge systems. So the question is, how then do we bridge the gap between indigenous knowledge holders and Western science? What is it that we need to do not to discard one, but to appreciate one, work together, and make sure that, because one would assume that it is the uneducated in South Africa who rely on traditional healers. Actually, it is not. Even the ones who go to a medical doctor for prescription for blood pressure, they actually go also to a traditional healer for something else. Now imagine what's the term, contraindications. You know, they take this concoction and it has not been tested whether it will contra something with the Panado. How do we then make sure that in the interest of the patient, not in the interest of traditional healers, but in the interest of the patient, there is a need for us as the Western scientists and the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge holders, to have a conversation so that the patients are protected. And that's why then we wanted to have some projects that would come out of that conversation so that we can have participatory research where the two systems meet and they come up with solutions together. I spoke about English being the mode of communication, but there are some things that our scientists and science communicators are already doing. On the top right, it is a YouTube that is one of our scientists at NRF. She actually communicated her research in isiZulu. And it's a YouTube a speech in isiZulu, and she's showing what the fish is, and she's describing her research in isiZulu. And we are encouraging a lot of our scientists to do the same, so that a young person can actually be able to say, oh, this makes sense to me. And then there is what we call a braai show and the ilukuluku. These are podcasts where science is described in isiZulu or isiXhosa. And this is very significant. And the last one there, it is from the University of the Western Cape, where they are describing or explaining astronomy in isiXhosa. And this team, so from the guy Sibu, who does braai show, I actually thought I was gonna see them today. He says many scientific terms lack equivalents in languages like isiZulu. This necessitates lengthy explanations that potentially hindering comprehension. And I agree. I still remember doing a crystallization experiment when I was in high school. I can tell you what crystallization is in English very easily, but I cannot tell you what crystallization is in Sesotho. And it's the simplest experiment that I did in school. But if I have to say it in Sesotho, then this child would get lost. So this is by far the biggest challenge, and we then need to ensure that we advance our language so that we are able to translate the science so that we do not lose the 80% of the population. However, the challenge is you are translating it into 9 official languages. When are we going to get there? So it is still a long way before we actually close the gap. In conclusion, the biggest challenge in South African science is not the inclusion of minorities, which is a challenge for most countries. But for us, actually, it is the inclusion of the majority, as I have shown previously. And this is what Professor Caroline Ottman from UWC, who was doing the translation of astronomy in isiXhosa. Lastly, if people can't hear science in their language, how can they be expected to trust it? And I believe that one of the reasons why we are still struggling with HIV in our country is because people cannot hear the science in their home languages. And because of that, they cannot relate. And because of that, they don't even trust what it is that we are saying. I hope that I have been able to convince you to transition from the traditional way of communicating science and ensuring that we move and understand our audience, be able to translate the message so that we do not lose our audiences. And obviously then, that requires us to do things differently. That requires us to be able to have conversations with each other. But in order for us to have those conversations, we need to decide how do we move beyond communicating only in English and communicating in other languages. And by the way, the South African situation is not unique to South Africa. There are so many other countries where the language of communication is not only English. However, we find ourselves just communicating in English. To be politically correct, because I am in the land of English speakers, I am not saying we should not communicate in English. I am saying, depending on where we are, we might be losing others if we do not make an effort to ensure that we reach them using the language that they hear. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Mamoeletsi, for this, I would say, very insightful and thank you again for this insightful talk. I think now it's time for Q&A. May I remind you that you can use Bvox.app, scan the QR code. I think the slide will be back again. And I'll ask Dr. Mosia to join me here while we are having, and also my friend Alice. So actually, I don't know where we should start, because I was struck, honestly, by your first slide, because there were like, it's not only one gap, as you mentioned in your in the title of your presentation. It's actually many gaps. There is a gap due to race, education, geography, the influence of post-colonialism in South Africa, which I would say has a kind of a very unique story, maybe repeated in other places, not in Africa only. But what have striking me more is about the language divide. So I ask you like a very simple question that may seem not known to many of our audience. How many official languages do you have in South Africa?
We have 12 official languages, so we have 11 that are spoken languages, and I think a year or two ago we added sign language as an official language.
So you have 12 official languages. How many other languages spoken in South Africa while they are not official?
I have no idea.
Let's say arrange, like it's like.
Well, you'll find Italians, you find Germans, you find Swahili speakers. Yeah, so you find Europeans who are now in South Africa, and you find a lot of people who come from north of South Africa who are in South Africa. So there is definitely more than 50.
So how you would see like handling science communication within a country where you actually speak 50 languages? Like I think this is very difficult. Like I don't know how you can even manage that.
So even thinking about that, whatever number, is too big a challenge. How do we handle science communication, even if we were to just talk to the 9 that are official languages? It is already complex enough. The challenge that we have, and I spoke about crystallization earlier. So when we go to school grade 1 to 3, we are taught in our home languages. And from there, it is English all the way. As a result, if you compare English and Afrikaans, for instance, Afrikaans is very advanced. You can actually do your degree in engineering and chemistry in Afrikaans. But you can't do your degree in isiXhosa. And you can therefore imagine, you can't say crystallization in isiXhosa. You have to say water has to evaporate, and then there is these crystals. That's the best way you can describe crystallization. There is no single word. And imagine then, multiply that into 9 languages before you even go to the other minority languages of the people who came from other countries to South Africa. Even if we were to just say the Zulus and the Xhosas, we just, for now, we advance your language. Then there is the minorities within the 9 official languages, the Ndebele speakers, for instance. So it's going to take us a long time.
I totally agree because I can relate to this. Because in Egypt, all of us speak Arabic, for example. But if you study science at university degree, you study this in English. So I studied pharmacy in English, and sometimes even I find it difficult to explain to even my parents who can speak English a certain scientific concept because of this. And I noticed usually because most of my education was received in a second or even a third language of mine, that whenever I hear a new term, I need to translate this back in my mind to Arabic. And if I was not able to do that, I find it difficult to understand it. Of course, it would be more difficult to communicate it. That's why I can really feel connected to that. Another point you have mentioned here about this relationship between science as we know it in our modern times, defined as a Western enterprise in a way or another, compared to indigenous knowledge. I want to hear more about your approach of trying to find the right balance to communicate this different type of knowledge.
So earlier on, I spoke about the leadership that we have from our government. We're very fortunate as well that the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation has made it a priority. So indigenous knowledge systems is one of our priority areas in the country. And because of that, there is even research that is happening in indigenous knowledge systems. And obviously then, you then need the indigenous knowledge holders to be the ones who are communicating whatever knowledge that they have. And it is easier in their case because then they can communicate, or they can communicate amongst each other. However, how then do they themselves communicate with the Western scientists or the people who do not speak isiZulu or Setswana, for instance, and they have to share this knowledge? I don't think we've attempted enough to have those conversations more so in their languages, and that's where things get lost. And that's where, again, that information is getting lost because we are becoming a lot more westernized, and we are losing the indigenous knowledge, that we hold as a country in general.
Mm-hmm. So I have a follow-up questions from one of the audience about that. Could you perhaps elaborate on how the epistemic hierarchies between indigenous knowledge holders and Western doctors and researchers, for example, might be overcome in practice in the context of this kind of dialogue session?
I do believe, and that's why earlier on I had spoken about dialogue sessions that we held, but the problem is we're not having enough of those. We need to have a lot more of those, and the importance of them is that information is very important, first and foremost. And I made an example about traditional healers, for instance, and where the health of a patient is at stake if we do not, put together the indigenous knowledge holders and the Western scientists to have a conversation together. Because then I, as a patient, might be very ignorant, and I'm just going there trusting that my doctor is giving me medication for headaches, and this one is giving me medication for flu. And if you get a Western pill, it will tell you don't mix this, don't mix that, eat before you take the medication, make sure you don't take alcohol before you do this. We do not have this on the other side. And when we mix them, then it might be very dangerous for patients, for instance. And therefore, it is very important for us. And it's not only in terms of the health, but it is in how, for instance, we raise kids. Mm-hmm. Different cultures we raise our children differently. A newborn we treat a newborn differently, and you would go to a medical doctor who would say, when you leave the hospital, do this and this and this, and then when you get home, there's a grandmother who's waiting for you, and the grandmother says, no, we don't do that with the children. No, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And therefore, it's very important for us to have these conversations so that the country can go forward.
So you mentioned now that there is some kind of research done on kind of indigenous knowledge. Who is doing this, and do you see it like it's trying to apply the scientific methodology as we know it in Western science? They are trying to enforce or apply this to the indigenous knowledge, or are they trying to, like people who are like having this kind of knowledge, trying to make it like somehow evidence-based or something like that?
It's more evidence-based. For instance, we were talking about one of the projects that is happening at Rhodes University, Janet, and what do we call cannabis? And for instance, we can isolate the oil there, and we can use it. As part of the indigenous knowledge, we know what it is that we treat with the oil. However, the Western side of us says, but what is in there?
Oil.
So we need to have better understanding of what is in there. We need to have better understanding of the chemical composition, and to have an understanding that is the chemical composition different from one area of the Eastern Cape or not? Is it the same composition throughout? Does the soil affect the chemical composition, for instance? So that's where it comes in. It's not to change how they see, but just so that they have a better understanding of the products that they have.
Another question from our audience is, how well represented are indigenous Black populations in the scientist workforce? If they are a minority of scientists who speak indigenous language, how can this work be upskilled?
Say that again?
So, about the representation of indigenous or Black population in the scientist workforce, are they a majority or minority? And if they are a minority, or a minority of them are able to speak the indigenous languages, how this could work, how this could be upscaled to communicate science?
So,
From a minority to another minority within a minority, I feel like it's...
we are a minority, but things are changing. They are changing slowly. Of the 80% of the South Africans who are Black, about 20% of them have a university qualification of sort. Of those, the number of us who actually go and do science and engineering is still very low. I remember, so when was it, 2012, I had applied for a position as a manager at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And I got the position, and the very first question that my boss asked me was, how is it that you made it as a Black person, as a Black woman for that matter, for you to actually reach this position so early? I think 12 years ago must have been a little bit early for her, but it was a question that a lot of people, when there are positions, they would easily say, but there is no Black female, there is no Black in astronomy, there is no Black in this and this. And that's where also government comes in. For instance, the National Research Foundation, we fund postgraduate students. And our policy says 80% of our funding actually needs to go to to Blacks. So in South Africa, when we talk about Black, it is actually the African, Indians, and Coloreds. So we are trying to change the picture in terms of the Blacks in general. And hopefully, in the next 30 years, we will not be saying the number of Africans and Coloreds in the STEM community is relatively low. However, having said that, the fact that I am a chemist and I have a PhD in chemistry does not mean that I am Mosotho, does not mean that I can communicate the science in Sesotho. Unfortunately, I can only communicate it in English because I don't know what crystallization is in Sesotho.
I think this is very interesting point of view here. I have another question from Jenny Metcalf, the former PCST president, about like, it's very interesting, your conclusion about the need to engage the majority of South Africa, and she argues that if that's not the case with most countries, because science communicators are very good at reaching those already engaged in science. But what about the majority that are certainly not? From your experience in South Africa, how do you see that?
It is still the case. And I think as you could see in one of the slides, where those who are educated, for instance, their knowledge of science is relatively high, their interest in science is relatively low, and contrast that with those with primary education or no schooling at all. Their knowledge is very low and their interest is equally very low. It is because those individuals, they actually care about the day-to-day things. And it is up to us to make them understand that actually science and technology is about the day-to-day things. I often make an example about going to the bank. So when I was growing up, every month end, so we're nearing month end, my mother would be given a check and she would then go to a bank to cash that. So that's how I grew up. However, now, I don't know when was the last time I went to the bank. And our children do not even know the door to the bank because our banks are on our cell phones. But we do not link that development to science and technology. And people, therefore, do not understand and are not able to say, oh, this is science, this is technology. So these developments are because of science. And these developments are actually technology, and they're making our lives a lot easier. And it's entirely up to us as scientists and as science communicators to make science relatable, to make science something that people see. I mean, something as simple as water purification. When somebody drives past a river, in Soweto we do not have rivers, we do? Yeah, but we don't have rivers. So, but there's one. Let's assume somebody in Soweto is passing a river, is full, and you can see the turbulence and it's brown, the water is brown. Yet when you open your tap, the water is clear and clean and you can trust it and you can drink it. It is the same water that was flowing through the river. But the people do not understand and they are not able to link the clean water and the water that is flowing through the river. How did it get from here to there? And it is our responsibility to communicate. And the more we link the day-to-day experiences with science, technology, and innovation, the more people will appreciate science and the more people will trust science and technology.
Okay, I have like a couple of questions that I will like combine together, especially about this kind of language divide, because you mentioned that it happens that English become more spoken, African become more spoken, other indigenous language, sorry, not indigenous, other language that maybe even non-official are less and less spoken. And sometimes you mentioned if you cannot understand this in your language, then you couldn't trust it. In a specific cases where translation doesn't work, how this could be like this kind of a challenge, how you can overcome this, and in the same time, if you need a language to evolve, then able to be like absorb these new scientific terms like crystallization, is there any way that this could happen? Because if we don't do this, what happens that the use of this language will decline at a certain moment, it will disappear.
It's a sad reality. Our indigenous languages will eventually disappear. My nephews and nieces, they speak more English than they speak Sesotho. Those kids who are brought up in urban areas, most of them, they speak more English than they do Sesotho. However, the bulk of our population still lives in rural areas, and therefore they are the ones who are still communicating in indigenous languages. We need to put in more effort in the translation, and the translation does not necessarily mean the one-word crystallization, but it is in simplifying the message such that people are able to appreciate it and not necessarily lose the meaning. And that is a challenge. And the thing is, it's not even about us, the science communicators. We are making this a problem of science, of scientists and science communicators. And that's because we are often very siloed in how we do things as scientists in general. I'm a chemist, I work alone in the lab, but if we were to include the linguists in this conversation, it would be a different conversation. There is no way I can describe crystallization. However, someone who spent ages, years at university doing a PhD in isiZulu can actually, when we sit together and I describe what crystallization is, this person, it will not take them even a day, even a minute to actually tell me, in isiZulu, you actually say it this way. But because I think that as a chemist, I can actually describe it, then this is where we lose it. And this is, I think, a call for us to drop, to pull down the walls and go to the other department, that language department, actually visit the people in the language department and say, hello, we want to communicate our science. Please help us to communicate our science.
Mm-hmm. So you, again, going back to collaboration and conversation. So conversation between traditional hearers and like doctors and or healthcare professionals who are trained in a certain way. And again, with people who are like involved in linguistics and like putting effort not only into translation, but even to create new terms, new words to make sure that this exists in this language. What I'm thinking of right now from all of these discussions, these questions, and of course your presentation here, most of the, let's say, the research in science communication, public engagement with science, responsible research, innovation, whatever you call it, is coming from Western countries, coming from Western perspectives. And what I noticed through attending different PCST conferences, this is my fourth one, that I found there are a lot of, like, I would say, research about science communication from different contexts, like from Latin America, from India, work with indigenous communities in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand. Do you think this is the right time for the global south, and I don't like this term, to have our own voice, to shape our own narrative, and to share what we have learned, because this is important, have to be heard and valued to the rest of the world? I would like to quote one of John Chase, one of my friends here. It was from the West to the rest, we need it from the rest to the West. How do you see that?
It is actually the time. We have a saying that Africa, the time is now. Maybe Global South, the time is now.
But how we can do this in practice?
The same way we're doing this. We can have our conferences. I mean, UCIA has the European Science Communications or Science Engagement Conference. What stops us from having the Global South? I'll probably go back to NRF and suggest this to them. But there's not, well, on the one hand, it is this conversation. On the other hand, it is actually research. Coming together and having conversations as researchers and comparing the lessons that we've learned from Nigeria to South Africa to Jamaica. There's nothing that really stops us. I think there is power in working together. And I think research and disseminating our research, dissemination.
So dissemination. I think this is maybe like the best thing we can conclude with. Today, the most two words we have heard were gaps, and the second word was conversation. So let's keep the conversation, and that's why we are here. Please, Nazar, thank you, Dr. Mamoeletsi Mosia, for having me today. So thanks to all of you for being with us. I think we have around 30 minutes of breaks in following up with our parallel sessions in different rooms. Have a great break and nice afternoon.